aviation. I'm not going to talk about aviation. So we've also done some work in medicine, and so I've got two examples here. We may not get to the second one. I guess I better stand here to so people remotely can hear me. So two examples. I probably won't get to the second one. First one deals with medicine, a medical application. The second one deals with an aviation application. And so I would characterize certainly the label that we mark ourselves under right now is human automation interaction. Because regardless of what discipline your application area you're dealing with, there's major advances proposed or occurring in the introduction of automation and sometimes autonomy. And so both of the examples I use are in the flavor of what happens or how can you integrate people with various kinds of software capabilities. And so these are just some references here. One's a paper that deals with and has both examples I'm going to talk about today. One of them deals with that. The other is if you wanted to see what one of our courses at OSU is like because of COVID, there is an online version of it meant to support an instructor meeting with the students still. You could look at that if you're interested in some of the kinds of content that we cover in terms of our educational program. And they told me I'm getting recorded. Okay, so potentially two topics. One, human aware AI. The second is biased situation awareness. So what impact can software have on the thought processes of people? And so depending on time, we'll get to one or both of them. And one thing, so given your activity and your focus on human aware AI, I was thinking a little bit about that framing, because it's actually not one that I explicitly think of as a framing typically. And so from my perspective, human aware AI is a means to an end. So we've got some needs out there in the real world, and how can the advance of human AI assist the technology in terms of supporting those needs? And so that's the framing that I'm going to use in terms of how can performance be improved and how can human aware AI be part of that technology advancement. I'm going to talk in terms of archetypal system design tasks, and in particular, I'm going to focus mostly on diagnosis or abduction. And so my view is that as researchers, what we're trying to do is find classes of solutions, such as ways to more effectively integrate human AI interaction or human AI awareness and vice versa into systems. And then I like to tell my students that there are some generic or archetypes of design tasks. And part of what makes you an expert and part of the goal of research is to make advances that are at that level of abstraction. So if you're doing diagnosis, if you're doing abduction, what are things you as an expert in designing human automation interaction or human computer interaction, what are things you could know that apply across many applications? And that's one of the major goals of research. And then you always have particular quirks or aspects that apply to the particular aspect or particular application you're dealing with. And these are just some of the areas where, in parentheses, the kind of areas that we work in. And I like to suggest that there are 4 or 5 areas of generic system design tasks that we know a lot about. And that one of the goals of students is to understand those. So when whatever industry they go into, if they're dealing with human computer, human automation interaction, they ought to be able to walk in and up front and say, here's what I expect in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of the person, strengths and the weaknesses of the technology, kinds of design solutions that make that interaction more effective. And so that's the framing in which I'm going to talk about this. And my first example deals with a diagnosis task, which in my opinion is the area that we probably understand the best in terms of some of the AI machine learning technologies. Okay, the other thing is that most of what I do, much of what I do, the example today being a partial exception, has to do with supporting individual versus distributed work. So again, the technologies to support those can, the details can be quite different. And so when we're talking about trying to find advances, we need to ask ourselves, am I trying to support people who are coordinating or collaborating with each other, or am I trying to help one individual who's doing a task in some more or less independent sense? And so to me, that's another dimension in terms of sort of the abstractions that we're trying to deal with in terms of improving system design. And in the real world in distributed systems, and there are virtually no non-distributed systems in the world, I would claim. In the real world, we are jumping between those. And an effective design has to help us to decide when do I switch from the more efficient coordinated work to actual collaborative work and vice versa. Okay, another dimension is the technologies that we develop can support lots of different roles, and many of these have been explored. Everything from, I think it's actually autonomous, and that could be as a major task or a subtask that's autonomous, so the software is doing it from start to finish, so to speak. Or it could be in terms of the classic consulting system, so to speak, that pretend they're the Delphic Oracle. Here is the answer. And the person is supposed to be the safety net or the critic that says, is that reasonable or not? And that's I would claim in the second case study, a major distinction, because the software can influence how that person, even if they're an expert, how they now approach the problem. Alternatively, and the example I'm going to talk about today is a critiquing system. So the software's job is to look over the shoulder of the person who is the primary problem solver. And so that difference between being the Delphic Oracle saying, here is the answer, now you think about it and decide whether you agree on what you want to do, to the person is doing the task and the AI is walking over that person's shoulder and is providing input as appropriate, or hopefully as appropriate as the person does the task. And then we have other kinds of applications such as learning and teaching and data fusion. And so the point being that these are other dimensions, decisions you have to make about what kind of technology, what am I trying to support? What kind of role am I trying to support with the technology? So that's sort of the exploration space that we all are dealing with. And each of you probably falls somewhere into one of these if you're dealing with artificial intelligence or you're dealing with machine learning. Okay, so I'm going to focus on diagnosis as one of those archetypal tasks. And what makes it hard for any agent, whether it's a computer agent, software agent, or a person, it's hard because there's a large problems of diagnosis that are hard to have large data solution spaces, large data spaces. There are different strategies we could apply, some of which are going to be more effective for some problems than for others. There are lots of knowledge requirements, so they're knowledge-rich environments. The stochastic nature, the noisy data part is critical to many of these real systems, diagnosis being one of them, that you don't have data that, given this piece of data, I know what the answer is with certainty. Multiple solution problems, which is one thing I'm going to emphasize in the example, makes it hard because I can have masking. And so in medicine, one disease is present, but there's another one also present, and it hides the symptoms of the first. And then we have constant data collection, so I can't collect an infinite amount of data, and time stress sometimes. So I need an answer now, or I need an answer in the next 10 minutes or the next half hour. So it's short time frames. So these are all things that make it challenging for us developing AI or machine learning systems in terms of how do they deal with these kinds of issues, but also for people performing the task or for a joint human software system. Okay, I'm not going to talk about what brittleness we know are associated with things such as machine learning systems or classic AI systems. So I'm not going to take the time to talk about that, but that's a consideration. Is in the sense that you're going to abstractly say, this is what makes those technologies brittle, and think about that either in terms of how do I develop a human automation system to provide safety nets, or how to advance the technology to reduce part of that brittleness. But what I am going to talk about is brittleness exhibited by humans, because when we talk about AI aware, AI that's aware of humans, my focus is going to be here that what we would like to know is where are the potential limitations of people? And can the AI be aware of what those limitations are? And can it collect data to monitor for those in the sense of a critiquing system? So can it monitor for those and have some sort of interaction that allows the person and the computer together to do a more effective job? And so to the extent that we know what that is, and we know a lot of different kinds of potential areas of brittleness exhibited by humans, and I won't go through those folders, but some of the more interesting ones are the questions of home representation. So those of you who are in psychology has a long history of studying how different representations influence the problem solving of humans. And for a given problem, one representation, the person immediately knows what either the right answer is or knows what the right data is to collect next. for other representations, that same person may never solve the problem. In psychology, there's very nice literature trying to understand how that happens. And so but that is an issue because typically we are somehow providing representations in our software as a result of the processing by the AI or the machine learning system. Then another interesting one is this category that I call hypothesis fixation. That is not a cognitive process, that is an output of cognitive process. So when somebody says, I'm trying to deal with the potential for hypothesis fixation, you have to ask, what's causing it? And so we've got a whole list of, and this is only a partial list, of different kinds of processes. Some come out of the psychology literature, some come out of the cognitive engineering literature, but a whole lot of things that some psychologists like to call cognitive biases. Some people have trouble with that word. But the bottom line is, software can cause you to generate, or the task can cause a person to generate a hypothesis. And that's, in most cases, one of the reasons people are smart. So it's a good thing. But a side benefit or side cost is that if I generate the wrong hypothesis, there are a number of cognitive processes that can then be triggered that lead to ineffective or perhaps unsuccessful problem solving. And so understanding what those are provides us with an opportunity to say, how can the software help with these areas where humans are limited or exhibit various kinds of limitations? And in order to do that, it needs to detect, well, am I dealing with a case where I have hypothesis fixation, for example? And so that's the sense in which I'm talking about AI-aware systems, is that in the context of a diagnosis task, we know where people need help. Can the software detect that there's a need for some sort of interaction in order to overcome one of these issues with hypothesis fixation, for example? And if so, how do we design that interaction? And that includes questions of how does the software represent what it's thinking, including what it's thinking about the human's thought processes, and use that in order to have a much better coordination or collaboration process. And so a little bit different, and from people I've talked to, there are a lot of other kinds of approaches and technologies and issues that are relevant to this. This is the slant I'm going to give you here today. And so just complement some of the other kinds of work, for example, with natural language understanding or image recognition and things that are very relevant to this. But I'm not going to touch any of those. I'm going to touch on if you've got a diagnosis path and people are fallible and the software is fallible, how do you make the software a little smarter so it knows what the person is thinking, it infers what the person is thinking, and can use that to be a good partner. Okay, so the broad question is how can human-aware AI and ML support effective joint human automation interaction? And this is one slant on that. All right. The task I'm going to talk about is one that immunohematologists perform. I'm not going to go into the physiology, so let me give you a 30-second variation on it. It's certainly very relevant to words we throw around with COVID these days. So we'll talk about antigens and we'll talk about antibodies. Well, in this case, we're concerned with trying to find compatible blood to give you a blood transfusion. And it turns out if we do that really wrong, if we get the ABO typing wrong, you can die. We aren't focusing on those, but are focusing on there's another actually 400 or so allo antibodies. Most of them almost never occur and have relatively little impact if you get the blood typing wrong. But there is a set of them that are important, and that is the list across the top here, ranging from a big E to a little e to a kel and so on. So our diagnosis set is to say, do you have one or more of those antibodies or one of the other 300 some. So it's narrowed down to what are the most important, most frequent, and they just look for those and then say, is there evidence something else might be there? And if it's something else, then life is tough. And so it is a diagnosis task. It is a multiple solution problem in the sense that you can have more than one of these. And this is one of several data sets that a representation of the results of several kinds of data that they collect. And so over here, these numbers, which are zeros and 2 pluses, that's data on the particular patient. They take some serum from you, and which has the antibodies in it. They mix it with red blood cells with known characteristics, and each of these 10 is a different red blood cell that has known properties that they use to test. They mix the two together. If we get a coagulation, then that's an indication that we have a problem that antibody is present. So if I have the antigen for a big K and the antibody in the test blood cell and the antibody in the serum for that patient mixing together and get coagulation, then I don't want to give you big K blood that has big K in it, red blood cells that have big K in it, because then you will have a pre-transfusion reaction within your body. Okay, so that's in 30 seconds or less the nature of the task. And that's what antibody testing is all about. What we're talking about, various diseases, the virus being one of those, and the like. And when they talk about those terms, they're talking about antigens and antibodies. And can we detect whether you have that antibody in the blood, or do you have an antigen that makes you sensitive to one thing or another? That's the abstract nature of the task, and that's all I'm going to teach you about this. There are multiple different kinds of data. I'm just going to show you one of the essentially data sets that they look at to make inferences as to what you have in your blood, what antibodies you have in your blood. There are others that are similar to this. So this is looking for antibodies, and another test that looks for antigens and things like that. I'm not going to go into all the different tests that could be run and should be run to get convincing evidence. But this will illustrate that kind of thinking in terms of the system. The AI system that I'm going to describe here has to cover that full space in terms of trying to provide support. So in the real world, they have a piece of paper that looks like this without the color stuff across the top. It's a manual task, and they go through and they look across. So one heuristic is if I have a non-reactive cell, meaning 3 zeros right here, and if I can go across appropriately and look at that cell, then we have let's see if I find one I can rule out. Let's see. Okay, I have a little c and a big C, which means it's homozygous for little c, which means it will give a strong reaction if the corresponding antibody is present, and therefore I can use it to rule. So it says if it's all zeros and I have little c yes plus and big C no, then I can rule it out. So it's a thresholding. It's very much a heuristic. It's a thresholding logic, and they apply that logic across each of these cells, across each of the non-reactive cells as part of their problem-solving process. And so they go through, and if they're being diligent and are good, they'll put a ruler across there to make sure they don't skip up or down a row. They will cross something out with an X if they've ruled it out. If they think it's unlikely, they might put a single hash mark through it. They'll circle it. They start to think, I think this is really there. So they have lots of knowledge, like if it's reacting like this, just an IgG, then it's probably an RH, a Kel, or a PID. And so they can, without any further thought, say those are the most likely candidates. And since this is stochastic reasoning, a stochastic process, all of those pieces of evidence together ultimately allow them to say, I think I know the answer, and here's what it is. Point being, the paper and pencil task is pretty crude. The first person ever tested was considered an expert, but he had just come off an overnight shift. And he actually skipped down a row as he was doing rule out. He was doing the wrong things out. So he did, in this case, he flew overconfident that he could follow the same row, didn't put a piece of paper or a ruler across there. You have all sorts of issues with slips. And the data I'm going to present has to do with smaller hospitals. And so at smaller hospitals, we had folks who were much less than expert at doing this task. And as you will see, it's a little remarkable the kinds of issues we have with their performance. The good news is it gives us a big opportunity both to study how do we help people to do this task, because there are thousands of these people in the country. And so it's just going to a hospital that has a blood bank, and we have a potential set of participants. And so it's nice in that sense. And it's nice that they do make errors with some frequency. You're not dealing with a 1 in 1,000 with the folks at the smaller hospitals. So you can actually study what's the interaction like when somebody makes an error. And the bad news for you all is if you have to get a transfusion in a smaller hospital, the recommendation of our super expert was take your own blood ahead of time of dealing. Anyway, so that's the nature of the diagnosis task. It doesn't feel quite like a normal, here's the doctor trying to decide whether you have COVID or a cold or something else. But in fact, it is like that, and we have multiple possible diagnoses, meaning antibodies that could be present at the same time. So there's a multiple solution problem, and we can and do have masking. And And then this is just another example of one to make the point that you can have data. So now we have 2's here and 2's here under immediate spin and IgG. So that suggests something different than the previous one is present. And so they're looking at those patterns and doing their rule outs and a variety of other things. And just to give you a sense of the kind of data that they're looking at. And then this is what, so the color coding, we tried to mimic all of the physical actions they take with a pencil on the computer. So the highlight function, if it's there, it will make a whole row yellow. So I can scan across that row easily. The rule out, which marks it in green, that means I have ruled it out. So my heuristic, which is fallible, has caused me to say, I don't think it's present. We can mark something as likely. At this point, because they haven't done the other tests, they've arrived at the conclusion from this data alone that C is the only one I haven't ruled out. So it's increasingly likely that C, and since it's reacting in IgG, it's probably an RH one of these others. So all the data so far says it's likely, but I certainly haven't reached a level of certainty to say it's confirmed. And so we just essentially created the equivalent of their paper and pencil markings within the computer. And this is one of my key themes, is that depending on how you design the interface between the person and the software, the automation can have more or less data about what the person's thinking. So if we left this as a paper and pencil task, and when they got done, they entered it into the computer, I think this is a big C. And all the computer can do is wait until they're all done and then provide some sort of critique. And so a critical part of building good, effective human automation systems where you want that interaction to be immediate and frequent is to design an interface where the person wants to use the tool you have. So this is actually easier for them to do than the paper and pencil version. So they want to use it. It has perceptual aids, it has memory aids, it transfers data from one form to another. It does all sorts of things that make their job easier. And they know they will be less likely, even if they didn't have the A underneath, they may be less likely to make that sort of error. And so they want to use it. And in the process of using it, every time they pick one of these capabilities and they click on something, so when they click this as ruled out, by definition, they just said, I see the data to rule that out. And so the software, by virtue of them wanting to use the interface, and by virtue of the kind of interface interactions it supports, has lots of data to infer what is that person thinking about, which then going back to the list I provided you with earlier of potential problem limitations in terms of human problem solving, it can be looking at each of those and saying, do I have evidence of one of those happening? And if so, then it can intervene a little more appropriately than if it's just done. And if I didn't have that constant interaction, then all I could do is wait till they're done. So the original critiquing system proposed by Perry Miller, they waited until someone was done with a task, and then the software said, I don't agree with you for these reasons. And that was a really nice concept, but not something that was terribly applicable because people did it, 10 minutes later, I don't want to know that I made a mistake in the first minute. And so the point being that interaction design, interface design is a critical choice you're making in terms of helping the system to be aware of what the person is thinking and doing and aware in a timely manner. And so this is an example of doing that, just using some color coding to support their problem solving and in the process to give the software some information about what they must be thinking. Okay, so this comes back to my list here. These are actually, in our proposal, we sat down with experts, said, what are the kind of things that could happen? And she, in a domain-specific sense, could give us examples of all of these things where people had difficulties, less experienced people particularly had difficulties. So we wrote a proposal to the National Cartwheel and Blood Institute saying, we think this task can be done better. Software support is useful. Here are the kind of weaknesses people have, and made this list and said, these are things we will look for, plus anything else we discover. And that led to the development of the software that you saw there. And part of what we did, though, was also not only to say what can go wrong, but what can go right. You don't just want to say, where could people make a slip, for example. So if you understand what kind of expertise is used, then the software can also be looking and saying, is this person applying an appropriate expert strategy? And so it's a higher level than did I put something out because I applied a heuristic to rule something out. And so we studied, among other things, what's the nature of the expertise that people have. And so that's important. That strategic level, if you will, in terms of the person applying problem solving strategies, is probably as important as the low level issues of slips and mistakes that people might make. And so these are all examples of expertise that we did see in different stages of this process. And so we can also ask, how does effective AI machine learning support effective interaction at a expert strategy level? And as you'll see, the less expert people we studied almost never applied all the expert strategies. There were huge opportunities to do things better. And in a little bit, I'll tell you why, in terms of an evolutionary sense, that has occurred. Because so far, I'm probably convinced you never to get a transfusion. Bank your own blood, and then you don't have to worry about it. But then you have to know you're going to be in the accident. Okay. So again, these are all, when we study folks' errors, we did see. So this hypothetical list, really hypothetical list that the literature would say we ought to put on our list in terms of possibilities. And these domain-specific lists we had for the proposal, most of those things really did happen with folks with different levels of expertise. Sometimes slips occur with experts, for example. And so experts themselves benefit from this kind of capability. And so all of these various things really did happen as we started to study this. Okay, so we studied performance of practitioners and students at different levels of science. So this was over in public students. So because the kind of capability can be used as sort of a critic watching and studying actual practitioners doing their job, using it or not. But it could also be used to teach students. And so the goal was something that could be used for either of those kind of purposes with a little bit of adaptation. And what I'm going to describe here is a test with actual practitioners. So the good news is, if you can go to get in the accident and go to a major hospital, and I'll just use OSU as an example, so I don't know where you draw the threshold, but OSU, all of them get enough feedback to be pretty expert at it. All of the medical technologies are pretty good at the task. They also, though, even given that, partly because they have one person whose job is, she is a human error detector. So this is also an interesting person to study, to say, if I'm trying to make AI that's aware, this is a person who's aware. So she gets their paper forms and looks at it and says, you're wrong, try again, or gives it to somebody else that it's important, or the time stress is there, so somebody else will do it herself. But her job was essentially what that level of AI aware software, that was her job. And so they might take 15 minutes, the original text, to do the analysis. 2 minutes, she says, I believe you or not. So she's not redoing the task. She has other heuristics and methods to say, I know you're wrong, but I suspect you're wrong. And then, yes.
So are there enough errors made to be able to study it, or there's so few errors that it's hard to study?
As you go to smaller hospitals at OSU, there are errors, but they're less frequent because, in part, because of this feedback system. They've got somebody every time they do it, he says, looks good or not. So they actually learn over time, so they become more expert. So a big hospital with someone in that role, you will find fewer, but not zero errors. But go to the smaller hospitals, they don't have that person providing feedback. And I'll go into other details later. They don't get good feedback to learn. And so they develop core strategies. They don't remember what they studied in school. And they develop core strategies on their own, and for various reasons maintain those. And so the error rates are you're defined astounding, actually. So we have lots of errors to study as soon as we went to smaller hospitals. And that's the good news. That's a research, and the bad news has a big. I guess I wanted, so you're not totally fine. The good news is that with the exception of being there, probably having a transfusion reaction with any of the others won't kill you. It just makes you sicker. You don't like that. And one of the reasons that at the small hospital you don't they don't learn much is because the surgeon says you were sick, you're a little sicker, that's just part of my normal variability, so it's not easily detected that this, you actually had one of these transfusion reactions with these others. Because the reaction itself does make you sicker, but not enough to, in many cases, cross that threshold and saying, whoops, we did something wrong here that we didn't anticipate. That's part of the poor feedback we can have for smaller hospitals. Okay, so this is focusing on system used as a critic, meaning I'm doing the task, and it was actually done at smaller hospitals. A medical technologist is doing the task using our system, and either with or without the feedback. In both cases, they got the interface advances. So it was equivalent in terms of the interface environment you were working in, but in one case, they had the immediate context sensitive feedback from the AI system. In the other case, they just kept on going on the merry way. It was as if they were doing it in paper and said, here's the answer, go grab that kind of blood, and had no feedback in that case. And so basically we used a within and between subject design. These were people who did it for a living. So these weren't students, these weren't trainees, these were folks who do it routinely for a living at smaller hospitals around Ohio. We gave a pre-test case and a post-test case, and we had two cases that were matched and were randomly assigned for counterbalancing sort of stuff. And then we also had, after they did it, they solved some additional cases that had other properties. And we picked cases that one was where you have masking, so two antibodies looking like one. Might be 1 in 1,000 in the real world, but it's a real one, and the experts didn't view that as a hard case at all. We'll see what the less than expert practitioners say. A weak antibody, so since it's noisy data, if this antibody is only showing very weak transfusion reaction, it may not be, it may have a very low rate, or you might have no reaction even though the antibody is present. Again, all the ones we picked are mildly difficult. That's how our expert would characterize it. Not hard, but mildly difficult for some of these people. Is difficult. So a weak antibody. So the stochastics mean that you might get no reaction, and so you apply a heuristic that is fallible in that case. The masking one, 3 antibodies. So we actually went to the National Center in Pittsburgh, who hadn't been involved in any of this, and said, give us a moderately hard case. So we weren't picking it, and they picked a 3 antibody case. So we basically tested them with real cases, with more than the full data set, not just what we're looking at with that one panel. Okay. Results. 69% of them ruled out the correct hypothesis wrong. 48% failed to rule it out when it was appropriate to do so. 90% failed to collect converging evidence. 38% produced a final answer that an expert look at and say, that's not plausible given the data you have. And 38% gave an answer that was a uniform. So these two antibodies together is almost never going to happen, and that's what your answer. And so they like to call those uniforms. So it's a uniform. You try again. Okay. The actual measure. So within subject design, the control group had 16/14 versus 15/50 in the 2 matched cases. The treatment group. So these in the pretest, no AI feedback. So all these folks are being tested equivalently. And in that pretest for the treatment group, they had 4 of 15 wrong, none of 16 wrong. So there's some issues with the data collection. The numbers don't quite all add up. But basically, the post test, it having the assistance of the AI led the error rate to be 0 on that kind of a masking case. And so that's promising. When we look at the more detailed cases, for 3 of the 4, we went down to a 0 error rate with the assistance of the critiquing system. And remember, this is just, we walked in there, we trained them on the interface and said, do it. So this isn't even with experience to understand the system very well. And so we knocked the error rate down to 0 on 3 of the 4 cases, compared to 33 to 62% for the group that just had the interface and no immediate context sensitive immediate feedback. The other group, we put in a task where we knew the software was incompetent. We deliberately left with the weak antibody. We did not put in the knowledge we knew to make it competent to detect, hey, this is a case where there is a fair chance that because of the uncertainty, our normal heuristics don't apply. And what we did was we gave the system meta knowledge, so it knew enough to know that this was a case that it might not be competent on. And so it didn't apply any of its normal stuff. It just, when it hit the data that said, hey, this is a difficult case because of the range of uncertainty, it basically raised its hand and said, hey guys, this is a really tough case. I can't handle it. Here's why I think it's tough. Use your knowledge. And just saying that reduced the errors from 50% to 19%. And so again, when we talk about making our AI systems a little bit better, having the AI system know where it is fallible, and building in the knowledge for it to detect it is a very interesting strategy which can have a big impact. And so all the system did was it says, be careful and apply your knowledge better. It didn't tell them anything else besides that. And so just that extra step for the same people causes them to apply their knowledge and apply it more effectively. And so that's an interesting form of interaction that's worth looking at from a technology development perspective. And right now we're doing a lot of work with unmanned aircraft systems, and a couple of the better companies, they don't think of it in the terms I just described, but in essence are doing that kind of thing because the machine learning that is driving their automation to fly these UAVs is fallible. And so how do you protect against that case where what it's trying to do is inappropriate? And most companies have no idea. When you ask the question, can your technology be brittle? They all agree that it can. And when you say, what can you do about it? They say we have to be really careful, as careful as possible to come up with a training set. And these other two companies say that's important, but here's a strategy to build some additional safety net on top of that. And as an aside, the better companies are folks who brought in people and have historically worked with things like rocket launchers and large systems. So they're not coming at it from I'm capable of building one of these things. It's just a small UAS, weighs 10 pounds, and I can do it from scratch without the expertise from aviation and other applications. So that understanding with systems that are larger, and so the consequences of a failure are much bigger. Those folks come in with some knowledge of how do I make a brittle, going back to the title of my talk, how do I make brittle technology useful? So I try to make it as unbrittle as possible, but then I do some other stuff too. And some of that other stuff is technology, and some of that other stuff is people. Okay, so anyway, rather encouraging in terms of can we do better? But, well, I'll save my list of what the conclusions are. Let me see, skip this. No, I won't skip that. Okay. So one key theme is the interface, the interaction you design has to take into consideration what data do I want to collect from the person, so that the AI can be aware of what the person is thinking or doing or perceiving. And that'll vary tremendously from one application to another. So if it's a general principle, how you apply it to your application, you have to think very hard about. And this turned out to be a really nice one in terms of allowing us, because of the tasks they did, to turn it into an interactive task with the computer to provide that data. So the first is think hard about your interface design. It has to be unobtrusive, otherwise you're not going to want to use it. So it's not just can it provide data. So I can't have a system that every minute says, what are you thinking now? It has to be I'm doing my task and provide data that allows the software to infer what I'm thinking. And in this particular, and you want to make it such that they want to use it. So the memory aid, perceptual aids, and other kinds of things it did for them were all so much nicer than doing it in the paper world that they wanted to use it. Then the notion that you provide that feedback not 10 minutes after I needed it, That changes the nature of the interaction, obviously. So how do I provide that feedback in order to help somebody to recognize that maybe, so we always give them the opportunity to say, I'm right, software's wrong. But allow them to say, well, wait a minute, I better think a little bit harder about this. And is the intermediate conclusion I just reached appropriate, or do I need to unmark this as ruled out and make sure I collect extra data on it? And then this last thing I mentioned, which is the notion of meta-knowledge, I find intriguing. So something is superficially simple as the software raising its hand and saying, this is a tough case, be really careful, has a huge impact on how well people use knowledge that they had, whether it gave them that hint or not. But without that hint or that nudge, they didn't apply the knowledge. And that's very encouraging. The challenge is, how do I build software that has the meta-knowledge to detect that? And then the other challenge, and we won't get to it here today probably, but the other challenge is, how do I present and represent that for the person so that it's meaningful and helps them to apply their knowledge, as opposed to not realizing that, thinking, oh, this is a tough case, I better apply knowledge that otherwise I wouldn't. And so I think what I'm tempted to do is quit there. So I have another whole case study having to do with representations, but given we got about 12 minutes late, and you said for me to shoot for 40 minutes, I'm actually over. So, and this is a nice cohesive thought, as opposed to me scrambling through another one. And so I'll put there, other than to comment that, and I'll go to the last slide. So the other one deals with an aviation application, so flight planning. So how do I flight plan when I have weather that looks like this? And how does software help or not help me? So again, focusing on the impact of brittle technology on the decision making by people. And so it was the other one. So we do, and other people have research which tries to understand, how does the interaction with the software change my thought process? And I illustrated it here once with the notion of providing meta-knowledge. The computer raises its hand and says, wait a minute, guys, I'm not complicated. This is a tough problem, think hard. In this case, it's much the representation for that interaction. But the point is, it's surprising how powerfully some sort of presentation of information, whether it's verbal or whether it's some sort of visual image, it's surprising how that can change the thought process of an expert, let alone a less an expert. Literally changes how they think, whether they use their knowledge, how they use their knowledge. And a nice, simple, sort of final practical example. So when you go to your doctor or you go to your vet, I train horses as a hobby, and every so often with this sort of have to take a horse down to Ohio State for a special consult. And one of the better vets there, when they've got the residents trailing along behind them, one of the better ones, she always starts out with, I don't want to know what the original vet said. She's saying this to teach the residents. And she basically says, as soon as you tell me that he thinks that this was a particular problem, so there was a particular ligament that's out of this ligament, I can't think this anymore. You have changed my process. And I want to be a second pair of eyes that are independent. So she's emphasizing the kind of point I'm making here, but in the software world, you can be much more powerful in terms of what you're presenting. And so her point was, simply hearing, here is a hypothesis, is a potential diagnosis from somebody, not to change her entire thought process, and she might therefore get it wrong. And so you don't have a second pair of second eyes if you bias that person's process to begin with. And so my point here is that software has the opportunity to have much more powerful images in terms of their effect on your cognitive process. So when I show you a picture saying, here's the software, here's my conclusion, or here's my situation assessment, you're no longer thinking the same. And I guess the last thing I'd say, which was in my abstract, is one of the guys that we've been working with at NASA likes to talk about AI systems as being con artists. Not intentionally, but if you have an explainable AI as a system, it's time to say, here's how I got to my conclusion in a nice, cohesive way. And the person is supposed to look at that critique and say, I agree or not. And the trouble is, if you have this phenomenon going in, it is now said in a way that it's trying to be informative, but in fact, it's powerfully selling you like a car salesman would. And so you're no longer thinking the same, and you're not, therefore, this independent safety net to say, is the AI system incorrect? And then so he likes to talk about the challenge with AI, explainable AI is it may produce really good con artists. And so you're not getting the person that has an effective safety net, even though your intentions were good. On the other hand, and in this case, I'm not going to say I know what the answer is, because there's value in knowing beyond the black box what does the AI system think about in the life. But how you do that can have a huge influence on the person's thought processes. And so your intentions were good, but the outcome, in some small subset of the cases, probably the outcome isn't as good as you'd like. So let me quit there. And like I said, this is probably a little different than a lot of the research going on in terms of human aware AI. But I think looking at particular applications and saying, where do people need help?